Welcome to the Sanity interview. My name is Rebecca Sugar, and my co-host AR is still away. He's in Israel. He brought us a report from Tel Aviv on Monday, and we hope he'll do that again soon, and we hope he's being safe. We have a quote of the week on every podcast every week, and I'm going to continue that this week, even though AR is not here. Sometimes the quote is words of sanity. Sometimes it brings us words of insanity. This week's quote is from Senator Elizabeth Warren, so I think you can guess where I'm headed. Senator Warren was commenting on the SCOTUS ruling yesterday about they upheld a law in Tennessee that was banning puberty blockers and hormone therapy for minors. And this is what Senator Warren said. Trans kids suffer when they don't get medically necessary care. This is a brazen political decision by the Supreme Court. So this quote actually struck me as insane in three distinct ways. First, that the senator was calling these interventions on minors medically necessary, for which there is absolutely no proof. Second, that she's calling it care. In my view, it's the exact opposite. It's the abuse of children. And third, that she's defining it as a political decision by the court, which is what most politicians say whenever they try to pass an agenda and the legal system doesn't allow for it. In this particular case in Tennessee, the plaintiffs were arguing that they were being discriminated against on the basis of their sex and that the state was in violation of their constitutional rights to equal protection. Of course, the ban in Tennessee was for both sexes. It was for all minors, boys and girls. So there was, by definition, no discrimination against one sex or the other, a fact which I'm sure Senator Warren knew. And I think the truly insane thing is that in 2025 in America, there are adults and senators and parents who are pushing all the way to the Supreme Court to have the right to abuse their children in irreparable ways. Okay, our guest today, on a completely different subject altogether, is Jeff Lewis. We're going to talk today about cryptocurrency and digital assets and Bitcoin and all of that. Jeff's a partner at Pantera Capital, the first U.S. manager of digital assets. They launched their Bitcoin fund in 2013 when Bitcoin was at $65. Where is it today, Jeff?
About 104,000.
104. So you're doing okay on that front. Jeff is also, interestingly, the founder and CEO of the American Flag Football League, the first professional flag organization in the world, which we're not going to talk about today, but we should talk about it another time. When I asked Jeff for his little mini bio, and this is a very mini condensed bio, he said something interesting, which I'm also going to quote. He said, what ties those two things together, being at Pantera and the founder of a American Flag Football League, is my belief that the most underestimated force in the world is the inevitability of change, which I think leads us directly into our conversation today about cryptocurrency. And I want to start with Bitcoin. Bitcoin is sort of, in my mind, like the Kleenex of this whole category, in that it's the word that's used to substitute for a category of things. Not all of those things are actually really similar to Bitcoin. But when people think cryptocurrency, the first thing they tend to think is Bitcoin, the average person. So we're going to start with that. I think that Bitcoin is two things. It's a financial instrument that was designed after the financial crash in 2008 for some very specific purposes to solve some very specific problems. It's also an instrument of liberty and freedom, or it was intended to be that. So I want to talk about both of those things. First, can you just address what are the specific problems in the financial system that Bitcoin was created to solve for, and how would you evaluate as of today if Bitcoin has solved those problems effectively?
Well, first, thank you very much for having me today. I appreciate it. And I just want to be clear that these are my own personal views, not necessarily the views of the firm. So if you look at the founding of Bitcoin, it rises right up out of the ashes of the global financial crisis. And it was a time where lots of people felt that the trusted institutions like governments and big banks had let them down. And so people were looking for a way to essentially exchange value with one another in the absence of those intermediaries, and a way to potentially protect themselves from bad behavior by a government, which is essentially devaluing their holding of fiat currency. So the idea was if we create our own means of exchange, our own currency, and our own system for transacting peer-to-peer, that we could kind of solve those problems. But what's interesting about Bitcoin is its journey is actually very much similar to the journey that gold took. So if you think about, for a long time in human history, gold was actually used as a means of exchange.
Right.
And both Bitcoin and gold have similar sort of supply characteristics, which is to say the supply doesn't change very much on an annual basis. There's kind of enough of it that you can find some, but there's not so much of it that it's so common that it sort of loses its value. It's kind of got this Goldilocks. I wonder why maybe that's why she's called Goldilocks. But it has this kind of Goldilocks quality of being kind of just right in terms of that balance. So there was a point where we used gold as money, but then there was a point where we sort of stopped using it as money and we started using it as a storehouse of value. And I think, unfortunately for Bitcoin, its moment as a means of exchange was very brief. Because the world kind of very quickly, I think, understood, most of the early adopters of Bitcoin were basically macro traders, commodity traders, people who understand like big trends. And as soon as somebody explained to them, there's this thing now, and it's this basically entry in a digital database, and it connotes value, and it has a cap supply. And there seem to be a lot of people who believe that it has value, and that seems to be growing. So essentially, we have cap supply and constant and growing demand. Well, you don't have to go to a lot of economics courses to think that thing probably goes up in price. Mm-hmm. Cap supply with demand, probably the price goes up over time. So people started to treat it more as a trading instrument, as a storehouse of value, and as basically a commodity, which is ultimately kind of where the authorities came out in terms of what they think Bitcoin is. Right? It was the first digital asset to be clearly defined as a commodity. So Bitcoin went from being money to being a commodity almost instantly.
And one of the criticisms people have of Bitcoin as a means of exchange is that it's too slow and the fees are too expensive. Why can't that just be fixed?
Well, part of the genius of Bitcoin, a lot of the genius of Bitcoin is in its ability to be secure and its ability to withstand, basically, it's never been hacked, never gone down, done over 1 billion transactions. So Bitcoin was not intended to be fast. It was intended to be secure. And it has achieved that. What you have are other blockchains that have come along that have built on the success of Bitcoin, where they are basically intended to process transactions more rapidly at lower costs. And we sort of successfully saw first Ethereum and then most notably Solana kind of improving on, the efficiency aspect of that Bitcoin, did not have.
So you're not predicting that we're ever going to be buying our milk at the supermarket with Bitcoin. It's a store of value.
We don't. Well, we used to buy things with gold, but we don't anymore, mm-hmm. right? And we certainly, we don't buy things with gold. We also don't buy. We don't buy our groceries with. We don't go on Amazon and buy things with Amazon stock. Mm-hmm. And we'll talk a little bit about what all these tokens represent, but basically, most of them are effectively, and this is what the regulation will bear out as we get our laws soon. But essentially, they are derivatives on the success of a project.
Right.
So they feel in some ways like equity. They're not structured in the same way. It's hard to regulate them in the same way, but effectively the risk is equity-like. And very often one of those uses is as basically an incentive mechanism for the people who are involved in the project. So just like Amazon uses its stock as currency to pay their workers or pay their suppliers or whatever, or to make an acquisition, Amazon stock is still not currency. Like we don't buy books or we don't buy groceries with Amazon stock. And so a lot of times when I think maybe the worst marketing decision ever for the cryptocurrency industry was the word currency in the phrase, because
what would you have called it?
Because what it is, it's not. Well, they're not currency, right? They're I like the phrase tokens is better. Because what the token does is I think it puts an image in your mind of like this is evidence of something, right? And essentially, what a token does is it evidences provenance, it evidences ownership, it evidences certain rights that you might have for governance or to get a discount on something or whatever. So I always use analogies for what tokens do, but they do a number of different things, but effectively they serve as an incentive mechanism, just like stock options do, or they can serve as almost like a coat check. They could serve as like a certificate of authenticity. When a bunch of years ago, my son, for a birthday present, bought me a autographed picture of Mickey Mantle with his signature on it, and on the back there's this little certificate that says this is real. This is an actual signature of Mickey Mantle. So it could serve that purpose.
So that's right.
Yes.
I was going to ask you about the authenticity issue a little bit later, but I guess the question then is, as new tokens develop, as new products come to the market, and more people become aware of them, will Bitcoin remain, do you think, the Kleenex of this space? Is it always going to be sort of the number one name in people's mind, or do you see a world in which Bitcoin becomes this sort of lovely memory of how it all started?
So Bitcoin had a promise, and the promise was essentially that there could be a better way to transact that would be faster and cheaper, and that people could have access to something other than their home currency if their home government was essentially hostile to the value of that currency. So the promise of Bitcoin, well, the first thing, as I think I said to you before, is really what Bitcoin did is it showed that these systems can work. We're talking about now, going back to 2009, we're talking about this immense volume of transactions without ever going down, without ever being hacked. And I think, I'm not an engineer and I don't play one on television, but I think there have been 24 or 5 versions of the software. There's no CTO. There's no board of directors. Somehow the community has managed this and enabled it to keep modernizing and keep upgrading. So
the magic of Bitcoin is not Bitcoin per se. It's the decentralized network that is the blockchain. That's the thing.
It's the fact that this decentralized system is secure, it is robust, and it does work.
Right.
And it works on a massive, massive scale. So if you look right now, Bitcoin is the black hole in our industry. Bitcoin sucks all the energy from the discussion, and it's an amazing force. And but really, when you think about what crypto really is, it's kind of 3 different buckets. It's Bitcoin, which is like, as we're saying, it's digital gold. And then there are basically a bunch of software companies trying to make money. Mm-hmm. And then there are collectibles, what people call meme coins, where essentially the coins are inert. There's nothing productive going on. There's nobody trying to collect any revenue, trying to process anything. It's simply a collectible, like Dogecoin. And they're completely distinct from each other. And because Bitcoin presented as threatening, if you were the authorities, Bitcoin comes along and says, we're going to allow people to go around you in terms of they're not going to have to hold your currency, and they're going to be able to transact and move things around. And remember, some of the first uses that people still kind of really associate with Bitcoin were illicit, the whole Silk Road thing. So people, if you were in government, you're like, you know what? I don't think I like something that is kind of saying to the world, I'm going to evade your authority. I'm going to undermine your authority.
Or if I'm a big bank.
If you're a big bank, you don't like that either, right? You want to maintain control. So The irony, though, is that where we are today is that the promise of Bitcoin is going to be paid off by something called stablecoins. And that stablecoins, we just had yesterday, the Senate passed the Genius Act, which will get us a very rational regime for regulating stablecoins, because people in the government over the last few years, and I actually think we would have gotten a stablecoin rule. This was being discussed under the last administration. So as much as we give this administration tremendous and well-earned credit for being much more positive towards crypto, we were going to get a stablecoin rule, I believe, anyway, even if Trump had not won. But basically, what the authorities have realized, and we've heard Besant say this and others, is they now realize that crypto is essentially a distribution network for the dollar and for treasuries. That if stablecoins,
way to shore up the dollar.
If stablecoins are 99% backed by treasuries, that's good. That's a distribution of treasuries out into the world. So if everybody's going to use treasuries as collateral and treasuries as a way to transact with one another, that's fantastic.
So just
for
tell
America.
the audience just a quick definition on stablecoins.
Sure. So a stablecoin is, because of the instability of things like Bitcoin or Ethereum, as when people were thinking, I'm going to go to the grocery store and pay for things with Ethereum. Well, it doesn't make a lot of sense to transact in things that change in value by multiple percentage points a day. It's hard to think about buying a house with Bitcoin, when you're negotiating the price of the house and all of a sudden you have $50,000 less when you go to settle the transaction. So people realize that these systems are great for moving value around, but it would be nice to have a real means of exchange that we could rely on and know that it would be stable, that it would stay at the same value. And so the idea was, well, we can do this by just simply basically taking what is effectively a money market fund. Think about a money market fund. A money market fund, the manager endeavors to keep it at $1. Every single day it tries to have it be worth $1. Well, why not use something that looks like that as $1 instead of $1? Because as we discussed, $1 is not really backed by anything, but a portfolio of treasuries is a promise by the government. So stablecoins are a way to basically tokenize value and move it around, and basically pay for things with something that everybody recognizes has a value. If you think about it, you're going to look on your phone and you could see $1 of USDC, or you could see $1 on the PayPal screen. And by the way, you look at the Chase app and you see $1. It's all just a digital representation of $1, right? There's no nobody's sending around bags of $100 bills. So if you think about what PayPal did, is they trained people to think about a book entry representing $1 and just moving that around, outside of the banking system, just with each other. And this is really the next step. So, I would describe PayPal as essentially a private ledger stablecoin based on trust. And why do we trust PayPal? Well, it's a public company. It's audited. They put out quarterly financials, and we could see that they basically, have all the money invested in relatively safe things that's sitting there. So we trust them.
But I, the user, can't see the ledger because it's private.
But you're relying on the management not making any mistakes. You're relying on the auditors doing a good job. We've had public companies fail. We've had public companies commit fraud. You have no idea what could happen. There are all kinds of scenarios. And if something happened to PayPal, you're a unsecured creditor. So all those dollars that you saw on your phone might not actually be dollars.
Right.
Now, I'm not suggesting there's anything wrong with how PayPal's managing their business. I'm not saying that at all. But I'm just saying that we trust them. But if they weren't trustworthy, it would be a problem. And we basically understand that, and we've learned kind of a behavior, which is that each time we've gone into PayPal and tried to then connect back to the banking system, it's always worked.
Right.
When I've tried to take the money that you sent me on PayPal or Venmo and then put it back in my Chase account, it works. So it's like, okay, I believe. But imagine that you could do this without having to believe. Imagine that you could do this where everyone can see everything and it's totally transparent. That's what stablecoins do.
Right. So what you're effectively arguing is what you just said, which is that blockchain is the critical technology here, and that it's important for all the reasons that you've talked about, and trust keeps coming up. And then we've talked about stable coins, and there's a trust benefit there to the user as well. You don't have to trust someone else. You have the ledger yourself. But there's a difference between Bitcoin and stablecoin in terms of this trust issue because, at least from the layman's vantage point, because when I look at stablecoin and I see that it's pegged to the dollar, and I see that it can be manipulated in the same way that the dollar can be manipulated. It can go up and down. And it's inflationary sense. It's inflation sensitive. And I think we'll get to this later. One of the criticisms about stablecoins is that it's really it's a conspiracy theory, I guess, more than a criticism, is that it's a gateway drug to sort of centralized control. So is Bitcoin, I'm going to ask you the theoretical question, is Bitcoin a better representation of the philosophy of personal liberty than a stablecoin is?
Well, okay, let's go back though to you can't drop that bomb, Rebecca, and then run away. So
I'm right here. No, I'm right here for you. I want the answer.
No, but this question about the man, right? I'm always very skeptical of like people who think they're going to live outside the system. These were the people who, when Easy Pass was invented, said, I'm not going to let the man know where I'm driving. I'm going to wait 5 minutes at these toll lines so that nobody knows where I am. Meanwhile, they don't have a cell phone. They don't use their credit cards. They don't make telephone calls. The man knows what the man wants to know. Okay. And
even if you use Bitcoin?
Our financial transactions, well, in the context of the regulatory regime that we're in, yes, the man does know, because we have all of these third parties who are going to have reporting obligations. You have to pay taxes when you trade Bitcoin. You can't. There is not going to be some kind of a mystical, perfect utopia where you can live outside of control.
Well, that's important to say, right? Because I think one of the promises of Bitcoin to a lot of people was this live outside the system, beat the man idea. And you're saying,
there are still people in the industry who believe in this dream. Yeah. But it's just not realistic. The fact is the government tracks our transactions. The government knows what it wants to know and will continue to know what it wants to know. There is this whole kind of question about whether stablecoins should be issued by the government itself, as what are called central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs, or whether they should just be private. I think it's a distinction without any importance, because at the end of the day, the government will be able to track what they want to track. And one of the great misconceptions about Bitcoin is that it's like really good for criminals, that it's a really good way to evade the authorities. And I remember,
but cash is better.
Well, bags of cash are way better. And I remember the first time I ever spoke at a conference in this industry, a couple of guys walked up to me right after the session who had very shined black shoes and white crisp shirts, and I was like, "Here comes the FBI! What did I do?" And they were guys from the criminal. These were investigators who were like, "Don't tell anybody, but we love when people use Bitcoin. We always catch them." So you leave your footprints, even though there's a lot of ways to sort of hone in and zero in on who you're dealing with. So the dangers of control by the government. We're going to have to deal with that ourselves. We're going to have to deal with that at the ballot box. We're going to have to deal with that in dealing with our institutions and our leaders. But the government, with technology, has all the tools it needs to know everything that we do. So then tell me,
what's the excitement around having a cryptocurrency, a stablecoin to use? Is it just speed? It's just an efficiency tool.
Better, faster, cheaper is everything.
That's
right?
it. The whole freedom conversation.
The freedom to be able to, the feeling that you get when you use PayPal is that you've been freed up, right? Because it's hard to actually send money to your friends, right? Who, if your friend lives in Europe and you owe them $300 and you want to send it, it's really hard. SWIFT and wires and mailing them travel checks, whatever the heck you're going to try to do, it's a pain. And all of a sudden, to be able to directly connect with one another and just get it done is value. And so getting speed, getting direct connection, and there are all kinds of implications once you have stablecoins, because now you can basically take all kinds of other assets and start settling them on blockchains. So we have still massive kind of the works are really gummed up in the financial system. Even though everything is digitized, it still takes a remarkable amount of time to settle things. And what we're going to see is once you have stablecoins as the way to pay for something, now if you're going to move stablecoins around on a blockchain, you might as well pay for other things that are normal, not crypto related, using those stablecoins. So you might start paying at the grocery store, you might start paying for an office building, but one way or another, you're going to get more and more and more transactions onto these rails. And one of the things that I have written about a lot is, I'm not very optimistic about the future of the banking system. If you look at banks, they've kind of outlived their usefulness. The logo of Wells Fargo, right, is a stagecoach, because you needed Wells Fargo. If you were going to move your stuff, which was physical, from one place to another, they had guys with guns riding on the stagecoach, protecting your stuff, and then they were going to put it in a room with a big thick door and close that door and turn the wheel. They were going to take care of your stuff. You needed them for safekeeping. Our stuff isn't physical anymore, right? So we still need safekeeping, but it's virtual. It's not necessarily needed that it be Wells Fargo or Citibank. And the other sort of misconception I think that persists is that banks create credit. If you look at the financial system, I think it was about 2 years ago I looked up the numbers. Maybe 85-90% of the corporate and mortgage debt that was created in the United States in that year was outside the banking system. So you think about in this neighborhood, right where we're sitting, there are all these massive, private credit organizations, massive. And, securitization has basically disintermediated financial institutions. They're much more now. They're not really creating the credit. You might go to a financial institution to get your mortgage, but they're not keeping it. That thing gets chopped up and distributed. They're just a distribution mechanism. So if banks are not really serving the purposes of safekeeping and credit creation that they used to serve, then what do we need them for? And if somebody can basically provide a better experience in terms of being able to move my money more easily, then I'm not going to want it sitting in the bank. So, it's very interesting to see the relationship of banks to this industry, because, they, at first were very wary and very negative, and now you see a lot of them,
right,
coming
so
around
because they recognize. Theory. Let's go back to conspiracy theories. We could make the whole show about them, but that's one of them, right? That they were reluctant at first, and now they're embracing them. And it's banks, it's BlackRock's, it's all of them. And so, what are they really after? Is what the tinfoil guys will say. And what do you make of that? What could be the explanation?
It's funny.
They see
right?
a way to make money, clearly.
Well, at the end of the day, they are still living in a market. So if they don't improve and somebody else offers a similar service that's better, then they're going to lose. So they're going to have to find ways to adapt and use some of these technologies to improve their own services, or they're going to die. But I think there is a kind of there's a little bit of an unraveling that I don't know that they really know that anybody really knows how to deal with, which is, this initial stablecoin rule, oddly, does not permit stablecoins to pay yield. But I think that it won't be too long before that changes. And essentially, your money is both instantly mobile, but is still earning, right? I don't really understand why we essentially, can't actually pay out the yield of the assets that are backing the stablecoin to the stablecoin holder. And so once you have that, you don't have this wall anymore between your money and earning money. So if you think about how difficult it is to both use your money and make money in the banking system, if you're in a savings account, you're limited to the number of transactions. If you're in a brokerage account, you have to liquidate the money market fund to get the cash so that you can send the cash. There are all these steps, all these frictions that go away once your money basically has a yield attached to it and it travels with that yield. And I don't think it'll be too long before we get there. And at that point, gosh, I really don't know why you need the bank. And it's certainly, I could certainly foresee a situation where in 10 or 15 years, the banking system is much, much smaller than it is today.
And the guys who are running it now, are they planning ahead for that? Is there any reason to be concerned that they are trying to manage this system now, take it over?
No, I don't think so. I think that, that what you have to watch for is part of the reason the government, did something during the financial crisis that I thought was really bad. which is there was a lot of money on the sidelines that wanted to come in, institutional money that wanted to come in and start fresh banks. This is the capitalist system, right? You're doing business, you mess up, you're down. So that now the economics of your business change. Spreads are super wide. There's a lot of money to be made, basically being a bank. And people raised their hand and said, we're going to replace these institutions. They messed up. Let us in. And the government basically said, no, we're not letting you in. And if you are involved in business activities that are not banking, and you want to start a bank, if you're KKR or whatever, and you want to start a bank, we're going to then look at we're going to regulate everything you do. Mm-hmm. And everyone was like, no, thanks, mm-hmm. right? And it was clear that what the government was really comfortable with was having a very small number of large banks as a tool to maintain control, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. The government, like, we know how to deal with these guys. They know how to deal with us. Let's just keep the club together and let's maintain them. It wasn't because they wanted to bail out anybody. And the whole concept that people got bailed out is a little ridiculous.
Why?
Because they basically their equity was like essentially wiped out. Mm-hmm. If you look at the return of a person who was working at Citibank or Lehman or Bear Stearns or something, they basically lost most of their money. Mm-hmm. So yes, the institutions were bailed out and survived, but it's not like the people who had invested in those institutions got their money back. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Not by any stretch. So not even today, probably never. So that is like, so I think that's going to be the interesting part as this evolves, is how are the regulators going to feel about the fact that there is this kind of erosion of the deposit base, because being a depositor at a bank is kind of terrible. Mm-hmm. Like, I hate it. I mean, I can't stand the banking system, working with the banking system. It's very, very hard to use your money. We talked a little bit at the beginning about this startup. And, the football league. And the fact is, when you have a startup, what do? You beg for money, beg for money, beg for money. Finally, somebody gives you some money, and then you go do stuff with it. Well, I can't tell you how hard that is in the banking system, because all of a sudden, when money shows up in your account, they're like, why do you have money? You didn't have money. Mm-hmm. And then it's like, well, we're going to
set up every fraud alert.
We're going to do this stuff. Yeah. And then it's like, and all these things are getting tripped. And now you go to spend the money, and they're like stopping the wires and checking everything. And it's like, it's our money. Let us use our money. Like, we're not doing, but it's so hard. Like, there are so many, like, all these checks and everything in the system.
Okay, so given that,
it's awful.
Talk about the Genius Act. Talk about regulation. What is in there that you think is useful and good? What sorts of regulations are you excited to see play out? Is there anything in there that might be concerning?
Well, as I said, I think it's definitely a little bit odd. I think I understand why there's no yield. Mm-hmm. The first thing is, everybody who's kind of involved, sort of has a seat at the table, sort of benefits in a way if there's no yield. Mm-hmm. Because it makes it easier to be a stablecoin issuer. You have a lot more revenue versus your expenses. And it's good for the banks because the stablecoin is less threatening as a competitor when it doesn't pay anything. So whether you're, the current issuers of stablecoins or future issuers of stablecoins, you'd sort of say, like, I kind of love the fact that I'm not allowed to pay any yield. But I can assure you that outside this country, there are stablecoins with yield, and people use them. If you were a person in, this is already happening in places like Brazil, right, where the currency, tends to devalue over time. And if you look, a person used to have to go into a Morgan Stanley private bank to get access to a dollar account. It was only the province of, like, really wealthy people to actually get out of the local currency and into dollars. A local person in Brazil can just go on their phone and basically exchange their local currency for a US dollar-backed stablecoin that has a yield. Mm-hmm. So, like, they're out. And by the way, the yield of a stablecoin basically being similar to a money market fund, effectively kind of protects them, at least in terms of purchasing power, because now basically you're earning effectively close to inflation. So it's pretty cool to have a sort of inflation-proof, dollar in your account instead of whatever your local currency is. And we're seeing this phenomenon actually all around the world, where the dollar is kind of starting to, incrementally become a larger and larger, portion of transactions. And it really works whether you're just an average person or whether you're running like a multinational corporation. to be able to have dollars that you can move very quickly versus having your old stuff on the old rails, people are going to opt for the better thing. And that's what's going to happen.
And who are these regulators? Is it David Sachs and his friends? Are they going to be a new office
No,
at the
this is
SEC?
this is the old. No, this is all being regulated by
the SEC.
Well, no, actually,
No.
So I think part of the reason that stablecoins probably don't have yield now is because there's been this ongoing turf war between the different regulatory authorities in DC about who gets to kind of have control of this. And most of that has sort of been won by actually the CFTC, which I think is interesting. But look, it doesn't really matter to us. All the industry's ever needed are just clear rules so that we could just do things without uncertainty. Everybody is willing to be compliant as long as we know how you comply. If you look at the history of Coinbase's interactions with the government, they constantly are saying, we're trying to find out what we have to do to not get in trouble, and you won't tell us.
Yeah.
It's this very strange
game. A little bit like social media companies have claimed, for the last years, but different. I want to ask you, though, what is it going to look like then? Let's say we have this set of regulations. Everybody knows the lay of the land. Are we going to have an explosion of stable coins? Are there going to be 2 or 3 that rise to the top that become the way we pay for everything, and then each company will have its own Amazon token, Uber tokens, et cetera, Walmart tokens?
Tokens, tokens that are associated with the business and stablecoins are different,
things. Right? But I'm just, is that what the world is going to look like? Instead of me carrying cash and my credit cards, or even, I'm so old, I remember actual checks, will people literally have a Bitcoin wallet and an Ethereum wallet and 6 stablecoin wallets?
No.
How is it going to work?
No, I mean, it'll really be, you'll have something that kind of looks like PayPal. It might even be PayPal. Mm-hmm. That's just moving stablecoin. That's just moving, open, transparent ledger stablecoins instead of private ledgered PayPal dollars. And it won't feel, the world isn't going to feel different to you. It's not going to feel like, oh my God, I don't know what to do. I've never lived in this world. It will feel normal. You already, when you interact with different businesses, you already get frequent flyer miles. You get points. You get discounts. If you think about,
call them tokens
think about
now.
what tokens do, right? Yeah. Is tokens basically evidence these rights, and they evidence these kinds of arrangements. Mm-hmm. So a person could today, let's say, you could start an airline, and you could start it by issuing frequent flyer miles, tokenized frequent flyer miles that people could transact that had value. So you say, okay, it's a startup airline. The miles aren't worth anything until we're actually flying to places. And the more places that we're flying and the more places you can use them, the more valuable they'll be. So the more successful this business is, the more these are going to be worth. But there's nobody who's going to sit here and say, those are equity, those frequent flyer miles. They're just property, right? They're just the right to basically get a discount or take a flight. So you could completely finance the building of this airline without ever selling any equity, without ever selling any debt, by simply using these things. People would say, I'm willing to speculate that this will get off the ground and that these will have value inside that system. Mm-hmm. So that's essentially what tokens are. They're something that basically sort of creates the ability of the system to operate. And it's really important, I think, for people to understand the difference between security, like equity securities, and tokens. Tokens are part of the operation of a system. Mm-hmm. So if I'm going to build a system, I can sort of create all the infrastructure, but then when I'm going to go out and start interacting with the world, I have to release the token into the world. So when we're investing as venture capitalists into these projects, we have much, much earlier visibility into how the world values the progress that the entrepreneurs have made or that the stakeholders have made, right? So we tend to see that there's much faster sort of public market visibility because the token's appearance doesn't rely upon success, whereas basically the ability to monetize your investment in a private business that you help start is really going to be a function of it having gotten to a scale of success, that it has now established itself, and now we can either in the private market trade it or take it public, but we know what it's worth because there's enough tangible success to say, look at this, it's worth something. Much earlier in the development process, before the tale is really told, in our world, that token gets out there. So that's part of why people will often say, a very large percentage of the tokens aren't worth anything. That some of that is because they're not productive, but a lot of that is because they're very nascent.
Right.
So just like in the real world, if a business is, most startups fail, and a lot of the tokens that you see are essentially, people often refer to crypto as kind of like, venture with a visible price.
Right.
So they're startups, they're nascent, and there's often risk that they won't work out.
I want to just get to a few more criticisms in the time we have left, and I want you to respond to them and tell me if they're valid or not. We don't have enough energy to run all of these systems. How can we create an entire digital financial system without the energy to run it?
Well, I mean, you're seeing a lot of there are a lot of the miners and so on that are using sustainable power. I don't know. I mean, I find that kind of like are we also going to stop watching Netflix and stop using Amazon? I mean, we live in it.
Might be a good idea.
It might be, but I don't think we are. So I don't think that's
Okay.
That was like kind of a fad maybe 10 years ago.
In other words, do we have enough energy to run it, or you're just not worried that we would create enough energy?
I'm not worried that we don't have access to enough energy.
Okay. Quantum computing has the potential to hack into the system and break the whole idea of the security and the trust behind blockchain. What say you, Jeff?
Well, why would you want to break into a bank if when you picked up the gold, it disintegrated? It really wouldn't be worth the trouble, right? And that's essentially what happens if you destroy Bitcoin. Then there's nothing to take. So why would you go to all the effort to break it? I mean, maybe if you're like a hostile foreign power or something.
I was going to say, aren't there political interests that would?
But I think, one of the responses that I hear most often to that question, though, is that the traditional financial system is actually more vulnerable than Bitcoin is. So if we get to the point where Bitcoin can be broken, they probably broke B of A and JP Morgan first. And you know what? There's a lot more to take there that is actually worth something. It's going to be worth the trouble. So, I think, as you basically what you would expect is that anybody who's threatened by this will be taking defensive action. And, just like the offense can get smarter and faster, I would assume the defense gets smarter and faster too.
And we've all lived through years of political debanking for various reasons. And what level of concern do you have that if we all go into a digital financial system that we will be punished for having the wrong views?
Well, we already have a digital financial system, and we already are punished for having the wrong views. So I'm not sure.
But if you're Bob Menendez, you can have gold bars under your mattress and maybe have a backup plan. But if we're encouraging everyone to go digital, all digital, are we risking being at the mercy of our overlords?
I really don't even. I don't know what the question is, because we all have everything that we have is basically on some third party's database. The government can see everything. The government. The pressure that it was really fascinating, right? What was so insidious about the pressure that was put on the industry, and it was very real, is there was nothing actually written down. There was no rule or law or regulation to say, oh, we have to go talk to whoever wrote this and get them to change it, or it's being misinterpreted, because it was not tangible. And it's really the most insidious kind of control, right? Because it was all by implication, it was all intangible. It was kind of like if you were the bank and you opened up an account for XYZ crypto project, you knew that you just might get more regular visits by the regulators than you would get otherwise. And so you made a very rational decision right? But it didn't say anything anywhere that that would happen, but you just kind of knew because from your experience, you saw what was happening to your competitors or colleagues or yourself when they did those things. So you just kind of learn what the rules of the road are and say, you know what, it's not worth it, all the extra agita that I'm going to get for taking these accounts, so I just won't take them. And there was nothing for anybody to say, you see this? This has to change. This is where they made this. There was nothing tangible. There was nothing explicit. So it was so insidious and so dangerous. And that risk is certainly still there.
Okay, so we're going to close out with your predictions. Nobody likes to make them, but I'm going to ask you to try. Predict where we are. The Genius Act, let's say, passes. What does it look like in the next year? What does the whole marketplace look like? What should we expect to see? And give me your projection on Bitcoin, the price of Bitcoin. Every day I go on social media and somebody's telling me it's going hyperbolic is their favorite word. It's going to go to $1 million a coin. And some people say it's going to zero. I'm sure it's somewhere in between. So why don't you tell me where that is? And any other important predictions you think people who are listening should pay attention to, should be looking forward to or being afraid of as this space grows?
Yep. Well, the first thing is I go back to that, like sort of the people who were originally attracted to Bitcoin, who noticed that it had a capped supply and constant demand and the price sort of would go up. And sure enough, over a pretty extended period, it's averaged about 85% a year appreciation. We just last year looked at the prior 11 years, and in 8 of the 11 years, it was the best performing asset in the world by leaps and bounds. And 3 of those years, it was the worst. Nonetheless, over the 11-year period, it was by far the best performing asset in the world. My guess is the volatility of Bitcoin will decline and the growth rate of it will decline over time, but you still face the same basic supply-demand characteristics. And the thing that you can't underestimate about Bitcoin especially is it's partly a commodity and it's partly a movement.
What do you mean by movement?
It's important to people. There are a lot of people in the world. If you look, we have these interesting statistics because it's all transparent. We can see every day what's happening in all the transactions. And I wrote this down. I wanted to make sure I got the numbers right.
You crushed me before when you said that it's really not about personal liberty. I thought that was the movement.
Well, but a lot of people think that the fact that they have this as a store of value, that they can be safe from all of the things that third parties might do to their wealth by hiding and holding Bitcoin, that's very important to a lot of people. So we track the data in terms of the wallets that hold Bitcoin and when they last transacted. And amazingly, 63% of the Bitcoin in the world is held by wallets that have not done any transactions for at least a year.
Interesting.
So they're not holding
and those
it because
are individual people.
Those are you don't know whose wallets they
right.
are.
That's part
but
of it.
That's a kind of an amazing thing. Like they're just like, I'm good. I don't really need to worry about whether it's worth 80 or 100 or 60 or 50 or whatever. Even more amazingly, 30% are in wallets that haven't moved in 5 years. Right? So there is a philosophical aspect. Like people want to have it and they're going to just keep adding. And they're going to keep it, and they're going to give it to their kids and to their grandkids. And it means something to them. It means something more than just a financial thing. So that's a very powerful, that's where this sort of constant demand comes from. But you can't underestimate the power of it being both a financial instrument and also kind of like a religion. And it kind of has
Bitcoin's here to stay. That's prediction number 1.
Yep. And, it'll go up, it'll go down, but over time it will continue to appreciate. But like I said, I think we'll see a moderation in the volatility and a moderation in the rate. It's not going to average 85% forever.
Okay. And any other big movements that we need to think about in the next year,
well, I think
5 years, 10 years?
I think that what people should be prepared for is there are going to be a lot of they're not necessarily going to see it. But I think it's much more important, not so much as consumers, but as investors, that people recognize that blockchain is just fintech that kind of got a bad rap and was under an immense amount of regulatory pressure. And the regulatory pressure has gone from being a negative to now being pressure to the upside. So we're just going to see a lot more different uses where you might not even realize that you're actually on a blockchain. But there's so many things that need to be redone. Twitter needs to be redone. Facebook needs to be redone. StubHub needs to be redone. You could redo Uber. But basically, opening up, you have much less potential for, one of the biggest things that you do get from crypto is transparency, right? And this is actually, again, sort of paying off the promise of Bitcoin. Just generally allowing the technology to go creates much more democratization, much more openness, much more awareness of what's going on, and much more voice for the participants in the system, because there isn't any management sort of running it from on high. It kind of really does come up from the
right. Like,
users.
in other words, if we had blockchain running USAID, we wouldn't have needed Doge to tell us how they were.
We would not. And if we had a decentralized version of Facebook, it would never have been a tool for suppression of people's views.
Censorship, right?
So like the real estate developer Frank McCord, who sold the Dodgers because he was getting divorced and found himself with $1 billion that he didn't expect to have, actually sort of reoriented his life and directed himself towards blockchain. And I've seen him present, and he's a wonderful presenter. And he says, I'm not an engineer and I don't know how all this stuff works, but I can tell you this, I am a builder. And I know that if a structure is unsound, you don't fix it, you knock it down and you build a new one. And from where I sit, the internet is unsound. It's unsafe. Your identity isn't safe. Your money isn't safe. You don't have power over your own worth, and it's time for people to be able to operate in an internet that actually works for them. And so you can only build that by rebuilding it, and blockchain is how you do it. So that's why people will hear the phrase Web3 a lot. So the last version of the internet was Web 2 and Web 3. And if you think about, one of the things that I always say is there's nothing new in crypto, nothing. The United States was really the first, decentralization, experiment in the world. It seems to have worked pretty well, even though we can always see, right, that the power of kind of trying to re-centralize is always there. It's like a magnet. But decentralization is not a new thing. And if you actually look at what is the common bond of all the great Web 2 businesses, it's actually decentralization. It's that eBay doesn't need to have a 40,000 person credit department to monitor all of the people transacting and making, because remember, they guarantee every trade, right? So that's a lot of exposure.
Yeah.
They don't have to do that because the marketplace does it.
Yes. Yeah.
Because the users do it with ratings and feedback. You look at the way Uber works, you look at the way that Amazon works. It's all the feedback loop. But the feedback loop is decentralization. It's taking things, instead of having them come from the top, having them come from the users and the stakeholders. So
this is probably why Democrats were so particularly opposed to this technology, because it runs counter to everything they believe about big government and centralization.
The irony of people like Warren being so negative about it. One of certainly my favorite politicians is Congressman Richie Torres, and he's gotten a lot of well-deserved recognition for being pro-Israel. But Richie also was a very early pro-blockchain person when it wasn't that popular. And Richie is super progressive. He represents one of the poorest districts in the United States. And he looked at it and said, this is good for my people. The system rips them off. The marginally banked person needs something in their hand. They need a little bit more power. They need a little bit less cost. Like, this has to be good for my constituents. Yeah. And he's not afraid. He's like a real liberal. He's not afraid of giving the people a little bit more. And the fact that, like you say, it kind of, it evidences the real lack of liberal, belief when people are so interested in control.
All right. With that, I thank you for coming.
Thank you.
And we hope to see you again.